So this summer we are doing a series looking at the parables of Jesus found in Luke's gospel, the third gospel. Of course, we find the parables of Jesus in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We don't find them in John, and Luke has a large number of the parables. Last week we started with the Good Samaritan. We talked about how important it is to show compassion, to show mercy, to stop and help those who are in need. And then if you remember, I also flipped it around and said, imagine putting yourself in the place of the guy that's in the ditch. And if you want somebody to stop and help you during your time of need in life, whatever that might be, then we should also be willing to do the same for other people. Today we move ahead to our next parable, which is a challenging parable, and that is the parable of the rich fool in Luke chapter 12. It's interesting to note how many of Jesus' parables deal with the subject of money and possessions. I think I read that of 37 or 38 parables, about 12 or 13 of them deal with the subject of money, possessions. It's a subject that he talked about all the time. And I said this spring during the stewardship campaign, it wasn't because he was trying to raise a budget for the church. There wasn't a church then. He wasn't trying to raise money. It's that Jesus knew how complicated our relationship to money and possessions would be, and so he talked about it all the time. Consider these things. Every single one of us has to deal with the issue of money on a regular basis. There's no escaping it. We have to pay our mortgages, we have to pay our bills, we have to pay our insurance, our groceries, our clothing, other things that we buy. It's a reality. Money and lifestyle expectations are the number one cause of problems and divorce within marriages today. I see it all the time, and I tell young couples when they get married that they need to talk through things and they need to be on the same page when it comes to expectations and when it comes to lifestyle and how they're going to live. Children will grow up heavily influenced, for better or worse, by the way that their parents deal with and teach them about money. The way a person spends their money and their time says more about who they are than anything else, because bank statements and calendars are moral documents, even if people don't want to admit that. It shows where our priorities are in life. It's always been the case that there are those who have lots of money and pretend like they don't have any, and those who hardly have any money but pretend like they have a lot. And that's just an interesting observation. Money makes a great servant, but a terrible master. Paul writes to Timothy in our epistle this morning that the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Our culture, unfortunately, has now managed to convince lots of people that somehow our net worth dictates our self-worth, which is a very scary thing because there are lots of people who are very wealthy, but they are morally bankrupt. Some people have more money than they could ever hope to spend. Other people anguish and stress over it all the time. It's a great source of stress in their lives. Greed and fear are two very important emotions. Not only do they drive the market, but they also drive the way that people act and interact with each other. So those are just some realities why I think Jesus talked about this subject so often in the Gospels, in the parables. We find it time and time again. But the truth is there is a lot of wasted money in our culture. Consider these things. They might make you laugh. Mike Tyson, the famous boxer, made tens of millions of dollars during his boxing career, but allegedly he spent $140,000 on 2 Bengal tigers to have as a pet. And then he spent another $140,000 on a trainer for the tigers. And then apparently when he was married the first time, he gave his wife a $2 million bathtub. Tom Cruise, when he was dating Katie Holmes and she became pregnant, Tom Cruise decided to buy a $200,000 sonogram machine to have at home so they could monitor the baby. You remember the thoroughbred racehorse, California Chrome, won the Kentucky Derby and the Preakness last year? Well, that horse went to auction, and guess who bought it? Jay-Z for $55 million. That is an expensive racehorse. Back in 2009, dog enthusiast Paris Hilton purchased a $325,000 two-story doghouse that was outfitted with air conditioning, heating, designer furniture, and a black crystal chandelier. It was 2 stories tall. It was designed to resemble her house so that the dogs could feel at home. Justin Bieber, one of my personal favorites, at one point was spending $8,000 a week on marijuana, not to mention all the other stuff that he buys his entourage that travels with him. Kanye West spent $60,000 to have his lower teeth removed and replace them with a gold and diamond encrusted bar. And then when he married Kim Kardashian, who's not on my list this morning, their wedding in Italy had a price tag of over $3 million. Now I could go on, and I can't verify all this because it's tabloid stuff. You can get it at the grocery store when you're checking out. But some of these decisions by people regarding money show us why Jesus' teachings about money and possessions is so important and why we have a culture that needs to pay attention to it. Luke tells us that a man comes up to Jesus and asks him to arbitrate a family squabble. There was a fight between 2 brothers about a family inheritance. If you want to see a good fight, go and watch siblings battle over family inheritance. But Jesus refused to get involved in this, but he does use this as an opportunity to teach. He says this, he says, take care. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. And then he gives a parable. A rich man had a land that produced abundantly. And he thought to himself, what should I do because I have no place to store these crops? So he decided to tear down his barns and build bigger ones where he could store all the grains and goods. He then says to himself, soul, I now have ample goods laid up for many years to come. I can relax, eat, drink, and be merry. But God says to him, you fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you, and the things that you have prepared, whose will they be? So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich towards God. I've always enjoyed reading William Barclay's commentary on the Bible. He provides great insight and illumination to many of these texts, and he says that there are a couple things that we need to notice about the rich fool in this parable. The first thing that he says is that he can't see beyond himself. He's only concerned with what he can do to store up his grain and his possessions. It's all about him and about his family. He simply is not worried about anybody else. His attitude is the exact opposite of Christian compassion. Instead of denying himself, he aggressively affirms himself. It's been said before, and think about this, that Jesus came to banish the words I and mine and replace those words with we and ours. Jesus came to banish the words I and mine and replace them with we and ours. Instead of trying to find happiness by giving things away and helping others, he tries to find happiness by hoarding and keeping everything to himself. He's probably thinking to himself, who knows when times will get bad and I might need all of this. The rich man in this parable is self-absorbed, consumed with himself. The second thing that Barclay says about this man is that he is not able to see beyond this world. All of his plans are being made on the basis of his earthly life. And if we only find ourselves thinking about this world, then we will become obsessed with possessions and constantly preoccupied with trying to figure out how we can accumulate more. Enough will never be enough. Now, I'll go ahead and state the obvious here this morning. This parable makes us uncomfortable because it seems to fly in the face of everything that our culture tells us we should do. Work harder, get ahead, save, invest, and then one day you can relax and retire. The earlier the better. And let's be honest, life is expensive. Nashville's getting more and more expensive. Have you noticed that? We'd all like to get to a point where we don't have to worry about money. And when I said that at 9:30, a little boy on the front row said, yeah. In verse 19, the rich fool says to himself, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. But the irony is, how many people are actually able to sit back and tell themselves, I now have ample goods laid up so I can relax, eat, drink, and be merry? I don't know many people like that. Even those that are already in retirement often wonder if they're going to run out of money before they run out of years, especially in an age where people are living longer and longer and longer. So what are we to do with this parable? We could skip it. That's what some people do. We could ignore it. We could pretend like it's not there. That's what some people do. But shouldn't we wrestle with it? Shouldn't we ask ourselves, why is Jesus telling this story? What is the message that he's trying to get across? One of my advisors at Sewanee, Bill Brosin, wrote his dissertation on the parables of Jesus, and he has a book, and in the book he talks about this parable. And in the book he says, what makes the man foolish is not what he did and said, but the attitude that was at the root of his decision-making process. He decided as one who only lived for himself and thought that he would live indefinitely. It's not that rich people will die and poor people won't. It's that rich people sometimes have a way of living as if they think they will never die. But he says they will. And if they wait until then to discover that life does not consist in the abundance of possessions, it will be too late in all kinds of ways. Duke scholar Richard Lisher says this about Jesus' mindset regarding the rich fool. There's no mystery here. This is precisely the sort of person you should not become, and exactly the foolish behavior you should avoid at all costs. You know, there's a lot of stereotyping in our culture, especially in politics. Rich people are selfish jerks who don't care about anybody. Poor people are lazy and they're just out to game the system. And these generalizations they're not fair, and frankly, they're not helpful. Politics has mastered the art of pitting people against each other. And Jesus is simply trying to remind us what life is all about. It's about love. It's about family. It's about relationships and having friends. It's about showing compassion and helping people who are in need. And there's all kinds of need in this world on every socioeconomic level. It's about honesty and character. It's about learning the importance of moderation and balance. It's about not living your life in fear, worrying all the time about everything under the sun. If you move ahead in Luke's gospel, do you know what you find right after the parable of the rich fool? You find Luke's passage on worry, just like in Matthew. Don't worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. Isn't that interesting how in the Gospels we find these teachings about money right next to these teachings about worry, because the two go together. What made this man foolish was not that he was rich. It's that he was rich and he had convinced himself that he didn't need to help anybody else. He was keeping it all for himself. There's a connection between human survival and our inclination to be selfish. And we have to do everything in our power to push back on that. We have to do everything in our power to not give in to that temptation to be selfish and to only look after our own well-being. We have to live in a way where we trust that there is enough. And even when we're generous and we give away some of what we have, there's still going to be enough. You know, young families really wrestle with this, and I can speak as a young father. I mean, we think about all the things that we need to pay for in life, and we think about the bills, and we think about children, and we think about education and all of that. And it's really tempting to go down that road and say, if I give this away, there's not going to be enough. I heard a guy speak in Orlando a couple months ago, a guy named Seth Godin. He's kind of a marketing guy, lives in New York, but somebody sent me a blog by Seth this week that said this. He said, don't expect much from a drowning man. He's not going to offer you a candy bar or ask how your day was. He's too busy not drowning. Generosity takes effort. It requires the space to take your mind off of your own problems long enough to see somebody else's. It requires the confidence to share when a big part of you wants to hoard. And it requires the emotional labor of empathy. Generosity begins by trusting ourselves enough to know that we're not actually drowning. And yes, there are people in our culture and in our city that are drowning, and they need help. And we're called to help them. But we can't live our lives with a scarcity mindset. That's not faith. God says in the Bible there is enough to go around. Learn to share. Learn to help others. If you want to do something later this year that'll change your life, something that'll give you a perspective like you've never had before, something that'll open your eyes to a new reality that you've never had, I'll challenge you to do something. In November, go with the Woodmont group down to Guatemala. November 4th to the 11th. I did it 2 years ago, and it was amazing. It was amazing to be around people who have so little, to be around people who really don't have anything, but they're so filled with joy and they're so filled with thanksgiving and gratitude. Two key verses from this parable that sum up the message. 2 verses to remember. Be on guard against all kinds of greed, and your life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. There's so much more. There's so much more to life. There's so much more to family and to relationships and to love and to compassion. Work hard. Do well in your job. But don't fall into that trap of thinking that your life consists in the abundance of possessions, because it doesn't. Amen.